And joining us now, the National Economic Council Director, Lawrence Summers. Dr. Summers, the headlines this morning tell it all, the problems you're facing. AIG, this company that has received $170 billion in taxpayer bailouts, has decided to pay $165 million in bonuses to executives, some of whom are in the very division that brought the company to near collapse. Now, I heard you earlier this morning on ABC say that this is outrageous, that these companies have to be able to operate, but your bottom line was there's not much we can do about it. I guess my question is why?
It is outrageous. The whole situation at AIG is outrageous. What taxpayers are being forced to do is outrageous. But as the president said in his State of the Union address, we can't govern out of anger. And if we simply throw up our hands, refuse to deal with any of this, we'll have the kind of financial catastrophe that we saw after what happened at Lehman Brothers. Now, it's a very complicated situation, but the essence of it is this. Secretary Geithner has negotiated very forcefully with AIG, and he has done everything that is legally permissible for the government to do to limit the payment of bonuses. But where there are contracts, binding contracts that were entered into long before the government put any money into AIG, we're not a country where contracts just get abrogated willy-nilly. And if we were to start doing that, there'd be potentially very destabilizing consequences. You know, everybody talks about how we got a plan with certitude on which people can rely. Unfortunately, it's just not a tenable option to start abrogating contracts. What the lesson of this is that we don't really have a satisfactory regulatory regime in place. Not a satisfactory regulatory regime to have prevented something like this. And this is something Secretary Geithner will be pushing very hard in his discussions with Congress, a so-called resolution regime that will enable, in the event that we see a mess like this again, the government to have the kind of broad legal authorities that would enable a resolution without some of the kinds of highly problematic payments that we're seeing from a company like AIG.
Well, I take your point, and I understand what you're saying, but I also know that in companies all over America, bosses are calling employees and saying, look, we're not going to be able to give you that raise that you thought you were going to get next year. People are taking pay cuts. And yet, we see the person that, in fact, the government more or less installed, Mr. Liddy, to run AIG, saying that we've got to pay these bonuses. I believe his words were to continue to attract and retain the best and the brightest talent. Well, if that's the best and the brightest, they're the people that got us into this mess. And you're saying they're going to go to work someplace else? I mean, you go to Starbucks in Darien, Connecticut, you'll find at 10 o'clock in the morning, the place is full of people sitting there with their computers looking for jobs. It used to work all over Wall Street. Bob, where is it these people are going to go?
Bob, it's terrible. It is terrible what the situation is, and that we find ourselves in this place. And the judgment that's got to be made is not what will satisfy our anger best. That's easy to figure out. It's what will best protect taxpayers, what will cause those businesses to operate in the way where there will be the smallest hole in the American people's wallet. And Secretary Geithner has used every legal authority he has with that sole objective. No one cares about the shareholders of AIG. No one feels the slightest obligation to people who led us into these difficulties. Really none. Okay. But they do feel an obligation to do what's right for the American people.
So these guys are going to get their bonuses.
The easy thing would be to just say, off with their heads, violate the contracts. But you have to think about the consequences of breaking contracts for the overall system of law, for the overall financial system.
Do you know if anybody asked them to voluntarily
Yes,
give
I
up
do.
these?
Yes, I absolutely do. And there was an important negotiation between Secretary Geithner and the Chief Executive Officer of AIG. Mr. Liddy has made clear that he was using all of his authorities, both legal and moral, to reduce the level of these bonus payments.
They said, no,
what can be done is being done.
All right. Let's turn to this whole situation of the banks. Do you know, Dr. Summers, what the banks have done with all of this money that has been funneled to them through these bailouts?
We certainly have a picture of what's going on in the banks, and we're getting a much closer and better reading on the situation of the banks through the stress tests that are an integral part of Secretary Geithner's financial plan. And we're certainly monitoring very closely the funds that go into all the financial activities of the banks. The reason I'm hesitating with respect to your question, Bob, is not to be evasive, but it's because these banks in a year take in $1 trillion, of which the government's 25 billion or 10 billion or whatever it is one component, and then they lend out on a very large scale. So it's not really possible to take a particular dollar that came from the government and say where that particular dollar went. But what I can say is that it is a crucial focus of what is a very close and intense relationship now between the supervisors and the banks following these capital infusions, that there be increased lending, to small businesses, that there be the kind of constructive steps that the president announced, which all the major banks are participating in to provide mortgage relief for homeowners, that there be enhanced activities with respect to consumer credit. It's going to take time.
But aren't you someplace down the line going to have to explain what it is, what the plan is for these banks? We've funneled all this money. Nick Brady, who used to be Secretary of the Treasury, who I think you know, said to me this week, you can't fix what you can't explain. Isn't the government going to have to explain what its plan is here somewhere down the line? The
President and Secretary Geithner have laid out the framework, and I'm very confident that before too long you will see the details of the plan emerge. As on Monday, you're going to see the details of one key component of the plan. Financial support and a number of steps that the government is taking to foster cooperation between the Small Business Administration and banks to increase the flow of credit to small business, which is a crucial place where we've been lacking. Credit, and that's been one of the contributors to unemployment. 70% of jobs come from small business. As the stress testing process proceeds, the President, Secretary Geithner, will provide more clarity with respect to what the strategy is with respect to particular financial institutions.
That one of the problems here is this lack of details. I mean, don't people who want to invest, they want to know what the rules for investing are. And those details, why is it, I understand that this is an extremely complex situation, but why is it taken so long to make those details public? Is it because it's hard to explain or because there really is no plan yet?
There's a clear plan. The plan has a pillar of support for the capital markets that enables banks to sell their assets to the capital markets. The plan has a pillar that is infusions of capital into banks to enable them to be in a position to lend. The pillar based on what's going to happen in the banking system is based on a careful and rigorous evaluation of the situation in the banks, precisely to overcome that problem of no one knows what's going on that's described. Those are the stress tests. Those stress tests are currently underway.
Some people have said that what finally has to happen is that the government has to create some sort of an entity like the Resolution Trust Corporation to buy up these bad assets, these toxic assets that the banks and these various places have on their books. So far, the administration has resisted that. Why? Not a good idea?
Well, I don't think there's any question that we're going to need to sell, and that there's going to need to be sales, and many of the bankers want to do it. And in the context of banks, particularly that find themselves in trouble, it will be necessary to sell so-called toxic assets. Whether those toxic assets should be sold to a single institution, whether they should be sold to several different institutions, is a difficult question. What was best, I think everybody would agree, and what should be the port of first call, it may not be the last resort, but should be the port of first call, is selling them in a way where they go into private hands. And that's precisely what the investment facilities that Secretary Geithner has spoken of are directed at, creating a vehicle that will enable banks to sell these assets not to a public owner, but to a private owner who may need to receive some kind of government guaranteed financing. But I think we do want to keep it in the private sector. You know, Bob, people often sort of make everything be the same, but you really had quite a different situation in the early 90s with the RTC. At that point, you had a large number of closed savings and loans. So the government had just closed down. Here, we're frankly trying to be preventive, and we're trying to help address the problems with the banks before they fail and need to be completely taken over by the government. And that presents somewhat different circumstances, and that's why the private sector approach that Secretary Geithner has spoken about has such power.
Let me ask you quickly about China. An extraordinary statement by the president of China saying he is worried about China's investment in the United States. They own about $1 trillion worth of U.S. bonds, and he wants some assurance that those funds are safe. I can't ever recall anybody questioning the safety of U.S. T-bills.
There have been occasional statements of that kind before, but you just have to look, even in the midst of a financial crisis like this, at the way funds are flowing into the United States, that the dollar has strengthened even in a period of great difficulty for our banking system. But there's no question that this underscores the importance of what the president has emphasized in connection with the budget, which is that we got to get this budget deficit way down from where it is, and we got to clean up the mess in our financial system, because that's obviously something that is important for confidence in our country and in our markets.
Do you think there's any, I mean, we saw last week that GE lost its AAA credit rating, its long-term credit rating. Do you think there's any chance that U.S. T-bills will lose?
No.
You think they'll retain their credit rating?
They are the asset of choice for people around the world, and as long as we manage our economy soundly, recognize that there are going to be very difficult moments like this one, but respond forcefully, but in a way that is calculated to identify what the problems are and resolve them. I think U.S. financial markets will work themselves out, albeit with a period of difficulty. You know, Bob, there's one lesson from the history of financial crises that no one can argue with. They all end, and this one will too. And what we just have to do is put in place the right policies step by step: jobs, housing, small business, credit, the banks. Put in place the right policies, learn the lessons so that something like this will never happen again. Don't panic. Put in place the right kind of regulatory regime. Do everything we can to cushion the impact, because this really is disruptive, and we will make it through this.
One final question, and this you can give a short answer if you choose. Reports that the president may now favor taxing health care benefits, something he said during the campaign he was totally opposed
to. That's not in the president's proposal. The president's laid out his principles for judging whatever we do. They emphasize lower costs and higher quality. They emphasize allowing people who've got a good relationship with their employer in terms of health insurance
so you're
to continue
saying flat out.
to continue that relationship. Those are the president's principles. He's put forth his proposal.
So we don't need to worry about him taxing health care.
Those are the president's principles. He's put forth his proposal. There'll be different things will come out of the Congress, but the president has put forth his proposal and his principles.
Mr. Secretary, thank you so much, or Mr. Director, I should say. Thank you so much for being with us.